93% of self-made millionaires in one landmark study said the same odd thing when asked about their wealth. They almost never talk about it, not at dinner, not with neighbors, not even with most of their own family. Meanwhile, the average person spends more time each month comparing car payments than they do checking their own net worth. That gap right there, between what rich people actually do and what everyone assumes they do, is about to change how you see every quiet, boring-looking person in your life. Walter ran the parts counter at a farm equipment dealer outside Dayton for 26 years. He wore the same brown jacket every winter, drove a Silverado with 210,000 miles on it, and packed a turkey sandwich in a paper bag 5 days a week. Nobody at that counter would have guessed Walter was worth more than the dealership owner. He never said a word about it. Not once, not even when a younger guy at the counter got excited about a new truck and asked Walter if he was thinking about upgrading his old one. Walter just smiled and said his truck still ran fine. That silence wasn't an accident, and it wasn't shyness either. It was a habit, one he'd built on purpose over almost 3 decades, and it turns out that habit is one of the biggest things separating people who quietly build wealth from people who quietly go broke while looking successful. You've probably met both kinds. The loud one, the one with the boat and the new watch and the stories about the market, and the quiet one, the one nobody thinks twice about. If you've ever wondered why the quiet ones so often end up ahead, the answer starts with something most people get backwards. Most people think wealthy people don't talk about money because they're private, maybe even a little smug about it, sitting on some secret pile they don't want to share. That's not really it. The real reason is a lot more practical and honestly a lot more useful to you. Talking about money, especially bragging about it, invites comparison, and comparison is expensive. The second you start narrating your net worth or your investment returns to other people, you start feeling pressure to prove it, to keep up appearances that match the number in your head. Walter figured that out early, back when he was 28 and watched a coworker buy a boat he couldn't afford just because he's made an offhand comment about a good year in the stock market. The coworker felt embarrassed into a purchase. Walter never forgot it. So Walter did something different. He built what he used to call his invisible system, a set of money habits so automatic and so unremarkable that they never gave him anything to brag about and never gave him anything to defend either. Every paycheck, before he saw a dollar of it, a chunk went straight into his 401k. Another chunk went into a plain index fund outside of work. He never adjusted his lifestyle when he got a raise, not once in 26 years, which meant every raise just quietly fed the system instead of feeding a new truck or a bigger house. By the time he was 50, most people at that counter still thought he was just getting by. He wasn't. He was sitting on more than most of the customers who came in driving brand new combines. If you want to know why that matters to you, right now, tonight, sitting wherever you're sitting, it's because this pattern isn't rare. It's the norm among people who actually build wealth instead of just looking like they have it. Stick around, because in a minute you're going to see exactly how far a habit like Walter's can carry an ordinary income, and it's a bigger number than you'd expect. But first, if you've ever caught yourself buying something just to keep up with somebody else, drop a yes in the comments. You already know the moment I'm talking about. Here's where it gets uncomfortable if you're being honest with yourself. That urge to look successful, to have the truck or the vacation photos or the new kitchen, isn't really about the thing. It's about being seen a certain way by people who, if you really think about it, probably aren't paying nearly as much attention as you assume. And the price of that performance is brutal, because every dollar spent trying to look rich is a dollar that can't compound. It's gone. It bought you a feeling for a weekend, maybe a nod of approval from a neighbor, and nothing else. Meanwhile, the quiet guy at the parts counter, the one nobody envied, was letting his money grow in the background while everyone else was busy performing. This is the part where you need to hit subscribe if you want the rest of this. Because next we're going to walk through exactly what Walter's invisible system looked like on paper, the actual numbers, the actual accounts, and how an ordinary guy making an ordinary wage ended up with a number most doctors and lawyers never reach. It's not complicated. It's not even hard once it's set up. But you need to see the mechanics, because knowing the idea and knowing the machine are two very different things, and only one of them actually makes you money. Let's rewind for a second, because there's a moment in Walter's story that almost derailed the whole thing. When he was 34, his wife Donna lost her job for about 7 months during a rough stretch for the local factories. Money got tight fast, tighter than it had ever been. A lot of people in that spot would have stopped their contributions, pulled money out of the 401k, hit pause on the whole plan until things settled. Walter almost did too. He sat at the kitchen table with the bills spread out and seriously considered stopping his automatic contribution just to breathe a little easier that month. He didn't, and the reason he didn't is worth sitting with. He realized that stopping wasn't actually going to fix the problem. It was just going to feel like it was fixing the problem, while quietly costing him years down the road. So instead, he trimmed everything else. They ate simpler meals for a while. They skipped the annual trip to visit Donna's sister. The truck stayed at 200,000 miles instead of getting traded in. The system kept running underneath all of it, untouched, because Walter treated it like a bill he owed himself before he owed anyone else. That single decision, made under real financial stress, is probably the reason he retired with as much as he did. Most people cut savings first when things get hard. Walter cut everything else first, and it changed the entire shape of his life. Now let's actually look at the number, because this is the part that turns a nice story into something you can use yourself tonight. Walter started contributing 15% of his income at 28 years old, back when he was making around $32,000 a year. That's not a huge income. That's a normal, unremarkable paycheck for a normal, unremarkable job. Assume his income grew slowly over the years, the way most people's does, with small raises here and there and a bigger jump when he got promoted to counter manager in his 40s. Assume he kept that 15% rate the whole time, invested mostly in a simple, low-cost index fund tracking the broader market, averaging something close to the historical long-term return. By the time Walter turned 62, that quiet, boring, invisible habit had grown into just over $1.4 million. $1.4 million, built by a guy who packed his own lunch and drove a truck with 210,000 miles on it. Nobody at that dealership ever guessed. His own kids didn't know until he sat them down in his early 60s and told them, mostly because he wanted them to understand where the family stability had actually come from. And it wasn't luck. Here's the piece that really matters, the piece that separates Walter from someone with the same income who never got there. The growth wasn't front-loaded. In the first 10 years, his account barely looked impressive at all. If you'd looked at his balance at 38, you'd have seen something modest, maybe even a little disappointing next to the effort it represented. Most people quit right around there. They look at 10 years of discipline and a balance that still feels small, and they decide the whole thing isn't working, so they stop. But the real growth in Walter's account happened in the last 15 years, when the money that had been sitting there quietly for 2 decades finally started generating more growth on its own than his actual contributions were adding. That's the part almost nobody sees coming, because it doesn't feel real until it happens to you. This is exactly why rich people don't talk about money, and exactly why staying quiet isn't about secrecy. It's about protecting a process that only works if you leave it alone long enough to actually work. Every time you brag about a big purchase, you're spending momentum. Every time you stay quiet and let a boring account sit untouched for another year, you're building it. Walter understood that trade instinctively, even though nobody ever taught it to him directly. He just noticed, decade after decade, that the people who talked the most about money seemed to have the least of it, and the people who never mentioned it seemed to be doing just fine. You might be thinking your situation is different, that you started too late, or your income is too tight to spare 15% of anything. That worry is normal, and it's not wrong to feel it, but it's also not the end of the story the way it feels like it is right now. Even a smaller percentage, started later, still compounds. It just needs the same ingredient Walter had, which is time left alone to do its work without interruption. The account doesn't care how you feel about its size in year 3 or year 8. It only cares whether you kept feeding it and kept your hands off it. Walter retired at 63, a year earlier than most of his coworkers, and he did it without ever once discussing money at that parts counter in 26 years. When people found out later, a few of them felt almost betrayed, like he'd been hiding something from them. He hadn't been hiding anything. He'd just been building something quietly, the way almost every person who ends up financially free does it, without an audience, without applause, and without needing either one. The real lesson underneath Walter's story isn't about index funds or percentages, even though those matter. It's about where you put your attention. Every dollar and every ounce of energy you spend trying to look wealthy is a dollar and an ounce of energy that isn't building actual wealth. The two paths look almost identical from the outside for years, sometimes for a decade or more, which is exactly why so many people give up on the quiet path. It doesn't reward you with anything visible for a long time. But underneath the surface, one path is getting lighter while the other is getting heavier, and eventually the difference becomes impossible to hide, even if you wanted to. If there's one thing to take from Walter's 26 years behind that counter, it's that the system mattered more than the willpower ever did. He wasn't gritting his teeth every month resisting temptation. He'd simply made the decision once, automated it, and then let time do the heavy lifting while he went back to packing his lunch and fixing tractors. That's the part you can actually copy starting tonight, whatever your income looks like right now, whatever mistakes you've made up to this point. None of that erases the years you still have ahead of you. One more thing happened near the end of Walter's story that most people never hear about, because he never talked about that either. A younger guy at the dealership, the same one who bought the boat all those years back and never quite recovered financially, asked Walter flat out how he'd done it once he found out the real number. Walter didn't give him a secret formula or a stock tip. He just told him the honest, almost disappointing truth that he'd started small, automated it, and stopped paying attention to what anyone else was doing with their money. That answer felt too simple to the younger guy at first. It usually does, right up until someone actually tries it and watches 10 quiet years turn into something real. So here's where that leaves you. The habit that built Walter's fortune wasn't loud, wasn't flashy, and wasn't something you'd notice if you were standing next to him at that counter for 26 years. It was one decision, repeated automatically, protected from interruption, and left alone long enough to grow past the point anyone could ignore it. That's the part rich people understand and rarely explain, not because they're keeping secrets, but because the habit only works in silence. If you want to see exactly how to build that same kind of automated system for yourself, starting with whatever paycheck you're working with right now, the next video walks through it step by step, from the very first account to the exact percentage that makes the math actually work in your favor.